I've made a couple of videos about Islam recently, and it's warranted a few responses. Those on the left say, the only reason you talk about Islam is because you're an Islamophobe, a bigot. You just hate them because they're different. And those on the right will say, I don't know why you make any concessions to Islam. There is nothing good about it at all. So I thought it would be fun to run myself through a test regarding Islam, outlining what I think is admirable or noteworthy about it, and then the counterclaim, which is not so admirable or noteworthy about it. Now, I do hold to Christian conservative beliefs personally, and I think that's important in framing what I'm about to say. And if you don't hold to those beliefs, that's obviously fair enough. However, I would at least sympathise with them as being part of the contextual makeup of English and British identity historically. So the first thing I could say I respect about Islam is that it does stand against modernity. The Western world has completely fallen apart because we've lost the idea of any sense of tradition. Henceforth, everything is mostly about self-centeredness and materialism these days. Further to that, Islam hasn't really buckled under the weight of the criticisms from the new atheists like Richard Dawkins. I'm not saying that Dawkins has no good points, but what I am saying is that Muslims seem to almost instinctively know that a tradition is deeper than just scientific beliefs or not. It speaks to your history as a people, your cultural practices, and your orientation in the world. Now, rightly or wrongly, this orientation is what appeals to young men who increasingly find themselves lost in a nihilistic and materialistic Western world, which is why so many young men convert to Islam. However, this also opens up what I don't like so much about Islam. It will use the techniques of modernity it often decries when it suits it. For instance, it will speak a lot about Islamophobia, which is really a progressive term stemming from the same schools as homophobia and xenophobia. The doctrine of Islamophobia will tell us Muslims are regularly picked on and they wouldn't do it to other people, whereas we constantly hear that from Muslims. For instance, even Mehdi Hassan, a famous progressive Muslim voice, was caught on camera once calling non-Muslims animals. And further to that, we all know their treatment of gay people. Pretty much every Muslim country brutalizes gay people and many of them kill them. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not the type of person that enjoys watching a load of men dress up in thongs and march up and down banging drums on Oxford Street, but I don't want to brutalise or hurt anybody for being gay. So on to point number 2, it sort of follows on from the last one. As someone with Christian belief, I often find that the modern Christian church will do anything to impress the Guardian, whereas the Islamic religion doesn't tend to bother so much about that. It genuinely does seem to want to serve God, and I know many of you may disagree with that, but having worked in offices with Muslims in the past, it didn't surprise me that many Muslims drank alcohol and chased women and really didn't live up to the things they said they did. What surprised me was there really were some people that really did fast. They really didn't drink water or eat food all day. And I spoke to many of them and found that they really were devout and dedicated. And again, it also opens us up to perhaps the counter case of this. As much as they may well serve God, there are fundamental differences in the practices of a Christian and Muslim religion, fundamentally between Jesus and Muhammad. Both of the founders of religion are notably different. Muhammad was a warlord, he did have slaves, he did have sex slaves, he did marry a 9-year-old. Jesus, on the other hand, gave his life for the world, for you and me. He forgave, and he taught us to try and forgive our enemies and not get lost in the world of emotion and hate and rather stay steady in the spirit. Next thing I can admire about Islam is it doesn't tend to buy into this woke modern gender madness. It tends to have held to the traditional dynamic of men and women. However, the counter case is a bit obvious here. While maintaining the traditional gender dynamic, they do tend to go a bit far. Things such as honour killings, acid attacks, and FGM are all too commonplace in such communities. Point number 4 would be that I can sympathise with their grievance against George Bush and Tony Blair's wars in the Middle East. Whether you think it was naive, a liberal ideology, or just searching for oil that inspired Blair and Bush is up to you, but there's no doubt there was mass murder going on and it was a completely unjust war. However, there's a strong counter case here that I never hear made. We hear a lot about how Muslims are victimised, they're bullied, never treated well. But we also never hear about any thanks at all for the gifts of technology the Western world has given the Middle East. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, the list goes on, are rich beyond their belief due to Western creations such as cars and airplanes and the knowledge of how to synthesize oil. But given the Western world is often labelled as a coloniser, it's kind of odd that we didn't steal that. We made them rich beyond their beliefs and gave them power on the global stage. Also, we get criticized for being colonizers a lot in the West, whereas Islam itself colonized much of the Asian world, and they seem to never mention that. And finally, as a person who sees value in spiritual practice, there is a side of the Islamic religion which I do think is a particularly beautiful understanding of the mystical relationship between man and God, namely Sufism. However, despite having quite beautiful spiritual practices, arts, and philosophies stemming from Sufism, it's a liberal lie to imply that that is representative of the majority of Islam. We of course know about the extremism as well as Wahhabi Salafism, but even mainstream Islam is quite out there compared to even very conservative Christianity. So, weighing all this up, I think it's fair to say I don't hate Islam. I more see it as an opposing civilization, one that hasn't been nearly as successful as Christendom. However, I do value traditions on the whole for different parts of the world. I think that they are deep and speak to the regions, the ethnos, the histories and mythologies of a people. Without them, you tend to find chaos ensues. Islam is a totalizing religion and always has been. I don't blame it for that, it's just the nature of it. However, these are just my views. I'd like to know yours down below. If you did enjoy this video, please do consider subscribing to the channel.